The morning air was crisp with a hint of humidity lingering from the night before, typical of New Orleans in early autumn. The golden light filtered through the Spanish moss-draped oak trees in Audubon Park, casting shifting patterns on the paved jogging trail. A few early risers were out, dog walkers, runners, and the occasional couple enjoying a quiet stroll before the city fully woke. Anna Moreau, dressed in navy blue scrubs and a lightweight hoodie, walked briskly along the path, her crossbody bag bouncing against her hip. She was on her way to St. Augustine Community Hospital, where her 12-hour shift as an emergency room nurse would begin in less than an hour. She had developed a habit of walking through the park before work, soaking in the serenity before the chaos of her day. The hospital was always a battlefield, accident victims, heart attacks, the occasional violent emergency. But out here, before the world stirred, everything was still. Until it wasn't. A sharp groan of pain caught her attention. Anna's head snapped to the right, toward a bench partially obscured by a line of shrubbery. At first, she didn't see anyone. Then a man shifted forward from the shadows, his broad frame tensed as he clutched his right ankle. His head was bowed, his thick, dark brown hair slightly disheveled. Anna's instincts kicked in. Injured person. Possible sprain or fracture. Needs assessment. She stepped off the trail and approached cautiously. "Hey, are you okay?" The man looked up. Deep green eyes locked onto hers, sharp and wary, as if he wasn't sure whether to accept or refuse help. His face was strong-jawed, dusted with light stubble, but there was something worn out about him, like someone carrying too much weight on his shoulders. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his body said otherwise. Anna crossed her arms. "You don't look fine." He exhaled, his frustration evident. "It's just a twisted ankle. It'll pass." Anna raised an eyebrow. "That's not how injuries work." Without waiting for permission, she knelt beside him, taking in the way he was gripping his leg. She reached out. "Mind if I check?" The man hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. She gently pressed along his ankle, feeling the slight swelling already forming. "It's not broken, but you need to keep off it for a while. If you try walking on it too soon, you'll make it worse." The man sighed, clearly annoyed at his predicament. "Great, that's exactly what I needed today." Anna let out a small laugh. "You say that like getting injured was on your to-do list." The corner of his mouth twitched, but the amusement didn't quite reach his eyes. Not exactly. Anna took a moment to study him. He wasn't dressed like most park joggers. No running gear, no headphones, no water bottle. He wore dark jeans, a plain grey t-shirt under a black zip-up hoodie, casual, but not meant for a morning run. And yet, despite the relaxed clothing, there was an odd elegance to the way he carried himself, even as he sat injured. Something about him didn't add up. "I can help you get somewhere if you need," Anna offered, standing up. The man shook his head. "I don't want to be a bother." She shrugged. "I'm a nurse. Helping people is literally my job." For the first time, something in his guarded expression softened. "A nurse, huh?" "Yep." She adjusted the strap of her bag. "And nurses don't leave injured people stranded on park benches. So, do you need a ride or what?" The man exhaled, as if debating whether to accept or insist on his independence. Finally, he nodded. "That would be great. Thanks." Anna gave a small smile, then held out her hand. He took it. His grip was firm, strong, but his touch was hesitant, almost careful. As she helped him up, he stumbled slightly, shifting his weight onto her more than he probably intended. His scent, clean, slightly woodsy, with a trace of something unfamiliar, briefly filled her senses. "Easy," she murmured. He let out a breath, straightening himself. "Sorry." "No problem." Anna led him toward the sidewalk, where her car was parked a block away. She glanced at him. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then answered. Jackson. Anna nodded. I'm Anna. Jackson studied her for a moment, then offered something that almost resembled a smile. Nice to meet you, Anna. She returned the expression, but couldn't shake the feeling that Jackson was hiding something. They reached Anna's car, a well-used but well-maintained silver sedan parked near the curb. She unlocked the door and helped Jackson ease into the passenger seat, making sure he didn't put too much weight on his injured ankle. You sure you don't need a hospital? She asked, sliding into the driver's seat and starting the engine. Jackson let out a dry chuckle. Trust me, I've had worse. I just need to rest it for a bit. Anna shot him a skeptical glance but didn't press further. Instead, she focused on navigating through the quiet morning streets of New Orleans, the city still stretching awake as sunlight glinted off the wrought-iron balconies of the French Quarter. So, Jackson, she said, keeping her tone light, what exactly were you doing out there in jeans and a hoodie? Doesn't seem like you were planning on a morning jog. He smirked, looking out the window as if debating his answer. I was walking. Thinking. Anna raised an eyebrow. Thinking hard enough to twist your ankle? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Something like that. She let the silence linger, giving him space to elaborate, but he didn't. The way he held himself, the way he answered just enough to be polite but not enough to invite real conversation, set off quiet alarms in her head. He wasn't just some random guy. His hands, resting on his lap, were clean but calloused, not the kind that came from an office job, but rather someone accustomed to both power and restraint. His posture was too controlled, too measured, even when he was injured. And then there was his voice, deep, smooth, but laced with an undertone of weariness, like a man who had spent years carrying something heavier than just his own troubles. Anna had seen people like him before, people with secrets. So, where am I taking you? She asked. Jackson hesitated. Just drop me off somewhere close, I'll figure it out. Anna frowned. You don't have a place to go? Of course I do, he said quickly. Too quickly. I just don't want to inconvenience you. She turned onto a quieter street, then glanced at him. It's not an inconvenience. But you don't exactly look like someone who enjoys being stranded on a park bench. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. Before he could answer, a phone buzzed from his pocket. His entire body stiffened. Anna noticed the tension immediately. You can take that, she offered. Jackson ignored the call. It's nothing important. But something in his jaw tightened. They hit a red light. Anna turned to look at him directly. You know, if you don't want to talk about yourself, that's fine. But you're giving off serious runaway vibes. He let out a dry chuckle. What gave me away? The part where you don't have a destination. Jackson sighed, rubbing his temple. It's complicated. I bet. For a moment he said nothing. Then, as if deciding something, he spoke. I just needed a break. From my life. From everything. Anna tilted her head slightly. That why you're walking around a park alone at dawn? He nodded, still looking out the window. Yeah. Anna wasn't sure what to make of that answer, but she did know one thing. This man was not just some aimless traveler. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Jackson finally spoke again. You don't have to take me anywhere special, just... Anna interrupted, already making her decision. I'm taking you to St. Augustine. Jackson turned to her, confused. The hospital? No, she corrected. The cafe across the street. It's a quiet spot, and you can rest your ankle while I grab you some ice. If you're planning on disappearing after that, at least do it on a stable foot. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge why she was helping him. Finally, he exhaled a soft laugh. You're stubborn. You have no idea, she said with a grin. The tension in the car eased slightly, but Anna's mind was still racing. Who was Jackson, really? And why did it feel like their meeting wasn't just a coincidence? The cafe across from St. Augustine Community Hospital was a quiet, unassuming spot, the kind of place frequented by nurses and doctors catching a quick break between shifts. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air as Anna helped Jackson inside, guiding him toward a small corner table near the window. "Stay here," she instructed, already unzipping her bag to pull out a small ice pack she always carried. Years in the ER had taught her to be prepared for anything, even impromptu rescues of strangers in the park. Jackson obeyed, leaning back against the chair, his fingers idly drumming against the table as he watched her move toward the counter to order. His ankle throbbed, but the dull ache was nothing compared to the storm raging in his mind. He shouldn't be here. Letting someone help him, letting her help him, was a mistake. His entire plan had been simple. Stay low. Stay anonymous. Don't let anyone get too close. And yet, here he was, sitting in a cafe with a woman who looked at him like she actually wanted to figure him out. A woman whose kindness made his well-constructed walls feel dangerously thin. Jackson exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He needed to leave soon. Across the cafe, Anna returned with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him before handing over the ice pack. "For the swelling," she said, before sitting across from him. "Thanks," he muttered, pressing it against his ankle. The cold bit at his skin, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him grounded. Anna took a sip of her coffee before leaning forward slightly. "So, Jackson, are you going to tell me why you were really out there this morning?" He looked up, eyes unreadable. "I already told you. I needed to clear my head." "Right, and I'm supposed to believe you just happened to be wandering around a park at dawn, with no destination, no running gear, and no intention of heading home?" Jackson smirked. "You don't trust easily, do you?" Anna shrugged. "Not when things don't add up." He studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You're sharp." She took another sip of coffee. "I work in the ER. I've met my fair share of people running from something." His smirk faded. "And what makes you think I'm running?" Anna didn't hesitate. "Because I know what it looks like." Something flickered across his face, but it was gone before she could decipher it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of clinking mugs and quiet chatter filled the space between them. Then Jackson exhaled, setting his cup down. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I want to talk about it." Anna nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Fair enough." She didn't push. That was new. Most people, especially the ones who figured out he was hiding something, wanted answers. They pressed, demanded, tried to solve him. But Anna just sat there, sipping her coffee, letting the silence stretch. Jackson wasn't sure if that made him more or less uneasy. Before he could decide, the cafe door chimed open and someone walked in. Jackson's entire body tensed. Anna noticed immediately. "What?" she asked, following his gaze. He forced himself to relax, but his heart pounded against his ribs. Robert Sinclair. Dressed in a dark suit, polished and composed, Jackson's assistant and closest confidant had just entered the cafe, scanning the room with an expression that said he was looking for someone. Jackson gritted his teeth. He had been careful. He had made sure no one knew where he was going. So how the hell had Robert found him? Jackson forced himself to remain still, keeping his expression neutral as Robert scanned the cafe. The last thing he needed was to draw attention to himself, especially not in front of Anna, who was already suspicious. But Robert wasn't just looking around. He was searching. And then their eyes met. Jackson barely had time to react before Robert started walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that meant he wasn't leaving without answers. Friend of yours? Anna asked, her voice casual, but there was something sharp beneath it. Jackson exhaled through his nose. Something like that. Anna studied his expression, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly around his coffee cup. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. Robert reached the table, his polished shoes stopping just beside them. "Jackson," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "I've been looking for you." Jackson leaned back in his chair, feigning ease. "I gathered that." Anna's gaze flickered between them. There was history here, unspoken but heavy, and she had the distinct feeling she had just walked into the middle of something she wasn't meant to witness. Robert turned to her with a practiced smile, the kind people in power wore when they wanted to seem approachable. "I'm sorry to interrupt. You must be a friend of Jackson's." Anna didn't miss how he carefully didn't use a last name. She hesitated, then shrugged. More like a nurse who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Robert's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation. "That sounds about right," he said smoothly, before turning his attention back to Jackson. "We need to talk." Jackson took a slow sip of his coffee. "I'm in the middle of something." Robert exhaled through his nose, clearly suppressing frustration. "It's important." Jackson set his cup down, locking eyes with him. "It always is." Anna shifted in her seat. The tension between them was thick, layered with something deeper than just a casual work relationship. And then Robert did something that made her stomach tighten. He slipped a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table in front of Jackson. Jackson didn't move, but his entire posture changed. His shoulders stiffened, his fingers twitched, small signs of restraint, of control slipping. Anna's gaze dropped to the paper. A one-way airline ticket, first class, New York City. Her eyes snapped back up to Jackson, realization dawning. Robert wasn't just some business associate. Jackson wasn't just some random guy looking to escape for a while. And this wasn't just an ankle injury in the park. "You're not just taking a break, are you?" Anna murmured, watching the way Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Because now, she knew, Jackson Devereaux was running from something much bigger than himself. And from the look in Robert's eyes, he was out of time. The tension at the cafe table was thick, like an unspoken challenge hanging in the air between Jackson and Robert. The plane ticket sat untouched in front of him, but its presence alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Anna didn't say anything at first. She just watched, waiting to see how Jackson would react. And he did nothing, not at first anyway. He didn't pick up the ticket, didn't shove it away. He just stared at it, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Robert, ever composed, folded his hands on the table. "You know this is necessary." Jackson let out a slow breath through his nose. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." Robert barely flinched. "It's not my opinion. It's reality. You can't just disappear." Jackson finally looked up, his green eyes sharp and unreadable. "I think I already did." Anna's gaze flickered between them. The weight of this conversation was pulling at something deep in her gut. She had suspected Jackson wasn't just an ordinary guy trying to escape something small. But now she knew it was much bigger. She just didn't know how much bigger. Anna cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Someone want to explain what's going on, or should I just pretend I didn't see that?" She gestured at the plane ticket. Jackson didn't look at her. "It's nothing." Robert let out a humorless chuckle. "It's a ticket back to where he belongs." Anna's brows furrowed. "Belongs?" Robert turned to her then, his expression polite but assessing. "Jackson has responsibilities, ones he can't afford to ignore." Anna looked back at Jackson. and yet he's ignoring them anyway. Jackson finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling like he was exhausted just by the conversation. "That's the problem, isn't it?" He glanced at Robert. "You act like I don't get a say in any of this." "You don't," Robert said evenly. Anna blinked. "Wow, that's direct." Robert didn't react. He simply tapped a finger against the ticket. "We have a meeting with your father tomorrow morning. You can take this flight and handle it like an adult, or you can continue playing this game." Jackson's fingers curled into fists against his lap. "It's not a game." Robert's expression didn't change. "Then stop acting like it is." The silence that followed was heavy. Anna could feel the weight of it, pressing into Jackson like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry anymore. For a brief moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but she wasn't about to let him off that easy. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "are you actually going to explain? Or should I just assume you're some kind of runaway prince and call it a day?" Jackson let out a sharp laugh. "Prince? That's a stretch." Robert sighed, rubbing his temple. "This is exactly why you shouldn't be talking to strangers, Jackson." Anna rolled her eyes. "I'm not a stranger. I saved his damn ankle this morning." Robert gave her a pointed look. "And now you're involved in something you shouldn't be." Anna opened her mouth to argue, but then she saw Jackson's face. The conflict, the hesitation. And suddenly she realized Robert was right. She shouldn't be involved in this, whatever this was. But for some reason she wasn't getting up. She wasn't walking away. And that was a problem. Jackson dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "Look, Anna, I appreciate what you've done. But this," he gestured vaguely between himself and Robert, "isn't something you need to worry about." Anna narrowed her eyes. "That's not an answer." Robert scoffed, but Jackson shot him a glare before turning back to her. "It's complicated." Anna huffed, leaning back in her chair. "You keep saying that like it's supposed to mean something. Complicated doesn't excuse you from giving a straight answer." She crossed her arms. "And I don't buy it. You don't look like someone running from a bad breakup. You look like someone running from something bigger. So tell me, what exactly are you so desperate to escape?" Jackson didn't respond, which honestly told her everything. Anna sat up, suddenly feeling the need to create some distance between them. "You know what? Forget it." She grabbed her coffee, taking a long sip before standing. "I don't have time for this. I have a shift to get to." Jackson frowned. "Anna, no," she cut him off, her voice firmer than before. "You don't want to tell me the truth. Fine, that's your choice. But don't sit here and act like I'm the one overstepping when you're the one who let me get involved in the first place." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't, because she was right. Robert, sensing the tension, stood as well, smoothing out the sleeves of his suit. "I'll walk you out," he said to Anna, though it was clear he had other intentions. Anna rolled her eyes but didn't object. She turned on her heel, heading toward the door without waiting for either of them. The bell chimed as she pushed it open, stepping into the warm morning air. Robert followed her out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. She expected him to leave once they were outside, but instead he stopped beside her, hands in his pockets. Anna sighed, turning to face him. "What?" Robert studied her for a moment before speaking. "You seem like a smart woman, so I'm going to assume you already understand what I'm about to say." Anna arched a brow. "Try me." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Jackson isn't just some guy who twisted his ankle in the park. He has obligations, ones that don't include getting attached to a stranger." Anna folded her arms. "You mean getting attached to someone outside his world?" Robert's lips quirked, as if she had just confirmed exactly what he had been implying. "I'm not here to threaten you, Anna. I'm here to offer some advice." Anna scoffed. Oh, well, that's a relief. Robert ignored her sarcasm. You seem like the type who likes to fix things, but Jackson isn't something you can fix, and if you try, you're only going to get caught up in something far messier than you realize. Anna stared at him, weighing his words. Then, with a small smirk, she took a step closer. You know what's funny? Robert raised an eyebrow. I was just about to walk away, she said lightly, until you came out here and made it very clear that I shouldn't be interested. She shrugged, her eyes glinting. Now I kind of am. For the first time, Robert looked mildly surprised, but it lasted only a second before he sighed, shaking his head. Suit yourself. Anna didn't respond. She turned, walking toward her car, the weight of Robert's warning still lingering in her mind. And as she drove off toward St. Augustine Hospital, she found herself thinking about Jackson, wondering what exactly he was running from, and why, despite every part of her saying she should leave it alone, she didn't want to. Anna had spent years learning how to trust her instincts. In the ER, instincts could mean the difference between saving a life or losing one. They told her when a patient was downplaying their pain, when something wasn't adding up in a trauma case, when someone was lying. And right now? Her instincts were screaming that Jackson Devereaux was a walking question mark, one she couldn't stop thinking about. It had been hours since she left him at the cafe, but his presence lingered in her mind like a puzzle waiting to be solved. She told herself she didn't care, that it wasn't her business, that Robert's warning had been enough reason to leave it alone. But the truth was, she hated not knowing, and so, during a rare moment of quiet in the hospital lounge, Anna sat with her phone in her hands, her thumb hovering over the search bar. It felt ridiculous, borderline obsessive. But who just disappeared for days without telling anyone where they were going? Who had an assistant that tracked them down with a first-class plane ticket and a barely concealed veiled threat? And why, despite the fact that she barely knew him, did Anna get the sense that Jackson wanted to talk, but couldn't? Her heart thudded once, hesitating. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she typed, Jackson Devereaux. The results were instant. Headlines flooded her screen, bolded names and dates flashing like warning signs. Heir to Devereaux Industries goes off the grid. Where is Jackson Devereaux? The mysterious vanishing act of a billionaire son rumors swirl as Jackson Devereaux misses high-stakes board meeting. Anna's pulse picked up speed. So he really was running. She clicked on an article. It was dated 3 days ago, right before she met him. Sources close to the Devereaux family confirm that Jackson Devereaux, son of Antoine Devereaux, has been unreachable for several days, sparking concern among investors. Devereaux, who was expected to take over as CEO following his father's declining health, has reportedly refused to attend recent corporate meetings, leaving the board scrambling to stabilize the company. Anna skimmed further. While neither Jackson nor his team have released a statement, insiders claim that the billionaire heir has long resisted the family business, fueling speculation that his recent disappearance may be an intentional break from his responsibilities. Her stomach twisted. So Robert hadn't been lying. Jackson wasn't just some lost guy figuring out his life. He was the heir to one of the most powerful companies in the country. And he had walked right into her life, pretending to be no one at all. Anna set her phone down, rubbing her temples. She had 2 choices. 1. Walk away now, pretend she never read this, and let Jackson handle his own problems. Or 2. Find out why someone with everything would risk losing it all. She already knew which one she was going to choose. Anna didn't like messy. She liked things that made sense, things that could be diagnosed, treated, and resolved. But Jackson? He was none of those things. He was an open case with no clear prognosis, and that fact irritated her more than she cared to admit. Her shift dragged on as she tried to shake the thoughts away, but by the time she clocked out, she still had no real answers. Just more questions. And apparently, one very stupid idea. Instead of heading straight home, Anna found herself back at the cafe where she had left Jackson that morning. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the French Quarter, and inside, the place was quieter now. Just a few scattered customers lost in their books or laptops. Her eyes scanned the room on instinct, but Jackson wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. She had no reason to expect him to be, but some part of her had hoped. She sighed, moving toward the counter to grab a coffee, telling herself she was just winding down after her shift, that this wasn't about Jackson at all. And then she heard it, a voice. Familiar, low but sharp, tense. Anna turned her head slightly, gaze locking onto a booth in the back corner of the cafe, and there he was, Jackson. He sat across from Robert, his expression unreadable, but his posture rigid, like a man bracing for something he didn't want to hear. Anna took a slow step forward. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop. She really shouldn't. But she did. Not happening. Jackson's voice was low but firm. Robert let out an exhale, clearly frustrated. Jackson, I don't think you understand how little choice you have in this. Jackson scoffed, leaning back. Oh, I understand. I just don't care. Anna frowned, gripping her coffee cup tighter. Robert's voice dropped. This isn't just about you anymore. Jackson's jaw clenched. It never was. Robert slid something across the table. Anna couldn't see what it was, but whatever it was, it made Jackson freeze. This is real, Robert said, his voice quieter now, but firm. And if you don't handle it, someone else will, and I promise you won't like how that plays out. Jackson didn't move for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. I'll take care of it, he said, his tone flat. Robert nodded, standing up. Good. Then, without another word, he turned and left the cafe, walking right past Anna without even noticing her. Anna barely breathed as she looked back toward Jackson. His hands were clenched into fists. His gaze was fixed on the table, on whatever Robert had given him. His entire body was wound so tightly it looked like he might snap. And in that moment, Anna knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking away from this. She was already in it. Anna didn't hesitate. She crossed the cafe in steady, determined strides, her pulse quickening as she approached Jackson's table. He still hadn't moved, his gaze locked onto whatever Robert had left behind. His fingers curled around the edge of the paper, as if he were deciding whether to rip it apart or surrender to whatever it said. She slid into the seat across from him without asking. Tell me what's going on. Jackson didn't even flinch. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for half a second before looking up at her. There was something unreadable in his expression, like he was weighing his options, deciding whether to push her away or let her in. Finally, he spoke. I thought you had a shift. Anna ignored the dodge. I did. She folded her arms. Now I'm here. Jackson's jaw tensed. Anna, don't bother, she interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. I heard enough to know you're in some kind of trouble, and I saw that. She nodded toward the folded paper on the table. Whatever's on it has you looking like you'd rather disappear than deal with it. His fingers twitched, but he didn't move the paper. Instead, he studied her, his green eyes narrowing slightly. You really don't know how to leave things alone, do you? Anna leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. Number. Especially not when someone who's clearly in over their head keeps pretending they're fine. A muscle in Jackson's jaw ticked. He didn't deny it. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, finally, Jackson sighed and reached for the paper, unfolding it slowly. He slid it across the table. You wanted to know? Here. Anna hesitated only a second before taking it. Her eyes scanned the crisp, expensive stationery. It wasn't just a letter, it was a legal document. Her stomach clenched as she read the words at the top, Board Summons, Devereaux Industries. She exhaled through her nose. They're calling you back. Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line. They're trying to force my hand. Anna kept reading. The letter stated in no uncertain terms that Jackson was expected to attend a mandatory board meeting in New York within the next 48 hours. If he failed to appear, the company would vote on a new CEO in his absence. And from the way Jackson's fingers tightened against the table, she didn't have to ask what that meant. They're going to replace you, she murmured. Jackson let out a short, humorless laugh. They're going to replace me either way. This just gives them an excuse. Anna frowned, setting the paper down. I thought you didn't want the job. I don't. His voice was clipped, controlled. But I wasn't supposed to be cut out like this. Anna studied him carefully. So why run? Jackson hesitated, his eyes flickering with something, resentment maybe, or regret. Because it was never my choice. I spent years being told exactly what I was supposed to do, who I was supposed to be. And when I finally said no, this happened. He motioned toward the letter, his frustration evident. Anna considered that. So if you go back, they win? Jackson scoffed. If I go back, they'll just use me however they want. And if I don't? He gestured vaguely. They'll move on without me. Anna tilted her head slightly. Then why do they still want you there? That made him pause. Anna saw it the moment the realization flickered across his face. There was something bigger at play, and he hadn't figured it out yet. Jackson stared at the document as if seeing it for the first time, his mind working through the implications. Anna could almost hear the gears turning, the unspoken questions racing behind his sharp green eyes. If the board was truly prepared to move on without him, why go through the trouble of dragging him back? Why send Robert after him with first-class tickets, veiled threats, and official legal summons? Why not just cut him out and be done with it? Anna leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so only he could hear. They need you for something, don't they? Jackson didn't respond right away. His fingers tapped against the table, his lips pressing into a thin line. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders tense. Yeah, he admitted. They do. Anna waited, watching as he ran a hand through his hair, debating whether to keep talking. Then, after a long moment, he leaned in, voice low and controlled. My father's health is failing. Everyone knows it, but no one's saying it out loud. He's the face of the company, has been for decades. The second he's out of the picture, there's going to be a war for control. Anna frowned. And they want you in the middle of it? Jackson's smirk was sharp and humorless. They want me to play the part of the obedient heir, to show up, smile for the cameras, and reassure investors that everything is under control. He gestured toward the letter again. This isn't about me. It's about optics. Anna processed that. So if you go back, you're just a pawn in their game. Exactly. And if you don't? Jackson let out a slow breath. Then they make their move without me. Anna studied him. And that's what you want? Jackson hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know. Anna could see it now, the weight of expectation, of a lifetime spent being told exactly who he was supposed to be. He had spent years resisting, running, but now the walls were closing in, and no matter which way he turned, someone was waiting to pull the strings. Anna knew what that felt like. She had spent so long fighting to keep control of her own life, refusing to let anyone make decisions for her. And maybe that was why she couldn't walk away from this. Because whether he saw it or not, Jackson was fighting the same battle. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "Okay," she said finally. "So what's the play here? Are you just going to sit in this cafe and wait for them to decide your future for you?" Jackson gave her a sideways glance. "You got a better idea?" Anna folded her arms. "Maybe, but it depends on how badly you want to get out of this on your own terms." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "What are you thinking?" Anna tapped a finger against the table. "You said they need you, right? They can't just replace you overnight, which means you still have leverage." Jackson arched a brow. "Leverage? You're the wild card here. They can't control you if they don't know what you're going to do next." Anna smirked slightly. "And I'm guessing that's not something they're used to." Jackson considered that. He had spent so much time focusing on the fact that they were forcing his hand, he hadn't stopped to think about what that actually meant. They needed him, which meant for once in his life he had the upper hand. Slowly, a grin tugged at the corner of his lips. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "you're way too good at this." Anna shrugged. "I deal with stubborn, high-maintenance patients every day. This isn't much different." Jackson chuckled, but there was something else behind it now, something lighter, more certain. For the first time since she had met him, he looked like a man with options. And Anna? She had just made the very dangerous mistake of stepping into his world. She just wasn't sure she wanted to step back out. Jackson sat in silence for a moment, rolling Anna's words around in his mind. Leverage. The idea had never fully occurred to him. Not because he wasn't capable of strategy, but because he had spent his entire life reacting to his father's control, rather than actively challenging it. But Anna was right. If the board was desperate enough to drag him back to New York with legal threats and veiled ultimatums, then they weren't as confident in his absence as they pretended to be. That meant there was an opening, a crack in their power structure, one he could use to his advantage. His fingers drummed against the table, a slow smirk forming. "So, hypothetically," he said, glancing at Anna, "if I wanted to make things interesting, where would I start?" Anna arched an eyebrow, sipping her coffee as if this were just another normal conversation. "Hypothetically?" Jackson chuckled. "Sure, let's call it that." She studied him for a beat, then leaned in slightly. "If I were you, I'd stop playing defense. They expect you to either roll over and do what they say or disappear entirely. You do either of those things, they win." She tilted her head. "So maybe it's time you start making them sweat for once." Jackson exhaled slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. His whole life had been dictated by his father's rules, his family's expectations. But now, sitting here with a woman he barely knew yet trusted more than anyone in that boardroom, he realized something. For the first time, he had a chance to dictate the terms. He pulled out his phone, unlocking it for the first time in days. A flood of unread messages, missed calls and urgent emails lit up the screen, each one more desperate than the last. He scrolled through them quickly, then paused. A text from Louis Beaumont, his best friend and lawyer. "Call me, ASAP. It's worse than you think." Jackson frowned. His grip on the phone tightened slightly. Worse than he thought? That wasn't a good sign. Anna must have noticed the shift in his expression because she leaned forward. "What?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed the call button, bringing the phone to his ear. It rang twice before Louis picked up. "Jackson, where the hell have you been?" Jackson smirked, but it lacked humor. "Nice to hear from you too, Beaumont." "Cut the crap. You need to get back here, now." Jackson's eyes flicked to Anna before he leaned back in his chair. "Why? So they can drag me into some meaningless board meeting where I nod and smile for the investors before they shove me aside." Louis's sigh was sharp. "If it were just that, I wouldn't be calling you like this. It's Celeste. She's making a move." Jackson's stomach went cold. What kind of move? Leverage, Louis said, his voice grim. She's using something against your father to push you out completely, and if she succeeds, you'll have nothing left to fight for. Jackson didn't respond. He didn't have to. He already knew exactly what that meant. And for the first time since running, he realized he couldn't afford to keep running anymore. Jackson's grip tightened on his phone as Louis's words settled over him, like a noose tightening around his throat. Celeste making a move wasn't surprising. She had spent years circling like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to strike. But if she had something big enough to use against his father, that changed everything. He forced his voice to stay steady. What does she have? Louis hesitated. I don't know exactly, but it's big. Antoine's scrambling to keep it contained, which means whatever it is, it's enough to shake him. If she's got leverage on him, she's got leverage on you. And if she plays this right, she'll turn the board against you permanently. Jackson's jaw clenched. Celeste had always been calculating, patient. She wouldn't move unless she was sure she could win. Which meant she had something real, something that could put an end to his claim over the company once and for all. Anna, who had been silently watching his side of the conversation, finally spoke. You need to go back. Jackson met her gaze, his muscles coiled like a wire pulled too tight. I don't... Yes, you do, she cut him off, voice firm. You said it yourself. If you stay out of this, they win. And if Celeste is about to play her trump card, you can't just sit here and let it happen. Jackson exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. She was right. He hated it, but she was right. Running wasn't an option anymore. He brought the phone back to his ear. How much time do I have? Louis didn't hesitate. 2 days, maybe less. Celeste is already lining up votes. If you don't show up, she'll use that as proof that you're unreliable. And once the board votes, it's over. Jackson's eyes darkened. Like hell it was. Book me a flight, he said. Louis exhaled, relieved. Done. I'll text you the details. Jackson ended the call and dropped his phone onto the table, pinching the bridge of his nose. He could already feel the weight of what was coming, the battle that was about to unfold. Anna watched him for a long moment before she leaned forward, voice quieter now. So what's the plan? Jackson looked up at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Then, slowly, a smirk curled at the corner of his lips. We make Celeste regret ever thinking she could win. Anna tilted her head. We? Jackson's smirk deepened. You wanted in, didn't you? Anna's lips parted, surprised. She hadn't expected that. But as she looked at him, at the determination settling into his expression, the fire that had been missing from his eyes since the moment she met him, she realized she didn't want to walk away. Maybe she should have. Maybe she still could. But instead she smiled, shaking her head. This is a terrible idea. Jackson chuckled. Probably. Anna sighed, finishing the last sip of her coffee before setting the cup down with a decisive click. All right then, Devereaux. Let's take her down. Jackson sat back, studying her like he hadn't expected her to actually agree. Then, after a beat, he grinned. I like the way you think, Nurse Moreau. And just like that, the game had officially begun. The flight to New York was uneventful, but the silence between Jackson and Anna carried a weight neither of them addressed. He spent most of the trip staring out the window, lost in thought, while she watched him, taking in the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against his knee, his body wound tight, like a coil ready to snap. She had seen people in crisis before, patients facing impossible choices, loved ones bracing for bad news, but Jackson wasn't just reacting to pressure. He was calculating, preparing, gearing up for a war he hadn't wanted, but now couldn't avoid. When the plane landed, a sleek black town car was already waiting for them, courtesy of Louis. Jackson slid in first, his jaw tightening when he noticed Robert in the driver's seat. The assistant didn't look at all surprised to see Anna settling in beside Jackson. If anything, he barely reacted, simply adjusting the mirror before pulling out onto the highway. "You finally made the right call," Robert said, his tone neutral but firm. "You don't have much time. Celeste has already started securing votes, and your father's condition isn't exactly helping your case." Jackson sighed, rubbing his temple. "How bad is he?" Robert's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Bad enough that if you don't handle this right, the board will use his health as an excuse to strip you of any influence left." Anna frowned. "They can do that?" Robert met her gaze in the mirror. "When billions are at stake, they'll do whatever they want." Jackson exhaled, his fingers drumming against his thigh. "So where do we stand?" Robert glanced at him. "Louis managed to stall some of the votes, but it won't hold for long. Your only real chance is to make a case strong enough that the board has no choice but to back you." Jackson scoffed. "Great. So I just have to convince a room full of sharks that I belong at the table." Robert didn't argue. He didn't need to. They both knew the odds were against him. Anna, however, wasn't convinced. "What about Celeste? What's her play?" Robert hesitated for a split second before answering. "She's pushing a narrative that your absence proves you're not committed, that you don't care about the company or the family legacy. And since your father isn't in any condition to refute it, she's got a perfect stage to take control." Jackson clenched his jaw, his gaze darkening. "So she's betting on my father being too weak to stop her?" Robert nodded. "Exactly." Jackson let out a slow breath. "Then we take that off the table." Anna frowned. "How?" Jackson looked at her, something dangerous flashing in his eyes. "By making sure they see exactly who they're dealing with." Anna watched Jackson closely as the car wove through the streets of Manhattan, the city's towering skyline looming above them. He wasn't just strategizing, he was shifting. The man she had met in New Orleans, the one who had tried so hard to disappear, was slipping away, and in his place was someone sharper, more controlled. This wasn't just a man returning to face his past. This was a man preparing for battle. By the time they pulled up to the Devereaux estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking Central Park, Jackson's expression was unreadable. He stepped out first, his shoulders squared, his posture deliberate. Anna followed, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She had walked into a lot of high-stakes situations in her life, but nothing quite like this. This wasn't an emergency room. There were no clear rules, no obvious right or wrong moves, just power, manipulation, and the quiet war happening behind closed doors. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with tension. Staff members barely made eye contact, moving through the grand foyer with silent efficiency. At the far end of the marble hallway, Celeste was waiting. Dressed in a perfectly tailored cream suit, her expression was one of mild amusement, as if she had been expecting this moment and found it mildly entertaining. "Jackson," she greeted, her voice smooth, calculated, "I was beginning to think you'd decided to sit this one out." Her gaze flickered to Anna briefly, eyes assessing before returning to him. "And you brought company?" Jackson didn't so much as blink. "I'm full of surprises." Celeste's lips curved slightly, but there was nothing warm about it. "I assume you're here to make your case before tomorrow's vote." Jackson tilted his head, his smirk razor-sharp. "No, Celeste. I'm here to win." The amusement in her eyes flickered just for a second before she recovered. "How bold of you! Though I should warn you, it's a bit late for theatrics. The board already knows where I stand. You walking in here at the last second doesn't change that." Jackson took a step closer, his presence undeniable. "You assume I came back to defend myself. I didn't. I came back to remind them who they're dealing with." For the first time, something shifted in Celeste's gaze. just a flicker of uncertainty, so fast most people wouldn't have noticed. But Jackson did. And so did Anna. Celeste straightened, her expression smoothing into something unreadable. "We'll see about that?" Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving the tension lingering in the air. Anna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Jackson. "She's not worried. That means she's already set something in motion." Jackson's smirk didn't waver. "Then we'd better be ready." Because tomorrow, everything was on the line. The boardroom of Devereaux Industries was a battlefield disguised as a conference space. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished oak table where 12 of the most powerful figures in the company sat, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed calculation. At the head of the table sat Antoine Devereaux, his presence still commanding despite the weight of age and illness pressing against his once imposing frame. His gaze flickered to Jackson as he entered, unreadable but sharp. Jackson didn't hesitate. He walked in with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to take back. Anna, standing just outside the room, watched as his entire demeanor shifted. The Jackson she had met in New Orleans had been guarded, reluctant, trying to stay in the shadows. But here, he looked like he belonged. Celeste sat near Antoine, her expression poised, a silent challenge in the way she tilted her chin. She didn't need to speak. She had already set the stage. "Jackson," Antoine's voice, though weaker than it once was, still carried authority. "You finally decided to join us." Jackson took his seat, slow and deliberate. Seemed rude not to. A murmur ran through the board. Some were watching with interest, others with barely hidden skepticism. He was the wild card, the missing piece they had stopped expecting to return. And now that he had, they weren't sure whether to welcome him or cut him out entirely. Celeste's smile was razor-sharp. "I think we all appreciate Jackson's presence today, though, of course, I do wonder if he's had time to catch up on everything he's missed." Jackson didn't take the bait. "Don't worry, Celeste. I'm all caught up." He leaned back, casual but controlled. "Which means we can skip the pleasantries and get to the real conversation." Celeste's smile barely wavered. And what conversation would that be? Jackson glanced at the stack of documents neatly arranged in front of her. "The one where you've been securing votes behind closed doors, convincing the board that I'm unfit to lead." He turned slightly, addressing the room. "That about sum it up?" A few of the board members exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Celeste exhaled lightly, as if this was all so predictable. "You've been gone for weeks, Jackson. The company can't afford uncertainty. You disappearing without a word created instability, and as you know, instability isn't something our investors respond well to." Jackson smirked. "Right, and I'm sure your solution is to take over completely, purely out of concern for the company." Celeste gave a small laugh. "Don't be dramatic. The board isn't against you, Jackson. They simply want a leader who's committed, someone they can trust." Jackson's gaze darkened. "And you expect them to trust you?" Celeste held his stare, not flinching. "Why wouldn't they?" Jackson leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to command the room. "Because I know exactly what you've been doing, and by the time this meeting is over, so will they." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Celeste's eyes flickered, a sliver of unease slipping through her mask. Anna, still watching from outside, felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The moment Jackson took control. And from the look on his face, he wasn't holding back. The room was thick with silence, the kind that carried weight, the kind that signaled something irreversible was about to happen. Jackson let it stretch, let the discomfort settle over the board members as he tapped his fingers lightly against the polished oak table. He had always been expected to play by the rules, to sit still and let others dictate his future. But this wasn't New Orleans, and he wasn't that man anymore. He was done letting them decide who he was. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the faces around him. You all think you know how this ends. You think Celeste has already won, that she's secured the votes and wrapped this up in a neat little package. But what if I told you that the story she's been selling you is nothing but a distraction? Celeste, still poised, didn't blink. If you have something to say, Jackson, say it. Otherwise, you're wasting everyone's time. Jackson's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. All right. Let's talk about leverage. His eyes flickered to Antoine, who had remained silent, watching. I may have walked away, but I've been paying attention. And what I've noticed is that someone has been quietly making moves behind the scenes, setting up an entire coup while claiming it's about stability. He looked back at Celeste. And you know what they say about people who try too hard to control the narrative. It usually means they have something to hide. Celeste's fingers curled against the armrest of her chair, just slightly, but enough for Jackson to catch it. This is nonsense. The board isn't interested in theatrics. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. You keep saying that, but you're the one who orchestrated an entire smear campaign in my absence. You spent weeks pushing the idea that I was unreliable, that I was a liability, while conveniently ignoring the fact that you've been working off the books to secure deals that would personally benefit you and not the company. A few board members shifted, some exchanging wary glances. Jackson knew he had them now. He could feel it. Celeste exhaled, her expression carefully neutral. You have no proof of that. Jackson's smirk deepened. Don't I? He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thin manila folder, setting it down with deliberate ease. He slid it across the table toward the nearest board member. Inside, you'll find documentation of unauthorized transactions linked to offshore accounts tied directly to Celeste's private holdings. You'll also find email correspondence outlining a plan to push Antoine out entirely once the board vote goes through. If you think I'm bluffing, go ahead. Take a look. A thick tension settled over the room as the folder was opened, papers quietly shuffled. One of the board members, an older man with graying hair, frowned as he read through the documents, then slowly looked up at Celeste. Is this true? Celeste didn't react immediately, but Jackson saw it, the momentary flicker of something like panic, the way her throat bobbed ever so slightly. Then, like the seasoned manipulator she was, she regained control, sitting up straighter. This is absurd. He's clearly desperate. Do you really think I would be foolish enough to— I don't think, Celeste. Jackson leaned forward, his voice lower now, the kind of quiet that commanded attention. I know, and so does my lawyer. This entire thing. It's already in motion. As we speak, there are people reviewing these same documents outside this room, and if I don't walk out of here with a fair shot at leading this company, then I'll make sure this information finds its way into the hands of every major financial news outlet in the country. Celeste's eyes darkened. You wouldn't. Jackson tilted his head. Try me. The boardroom was silent. Antoine watched, his gaze sharp despite his illness, and Jackson knew this was the moment everything shifted. Finally, one of the board members cleared their throat. If this information is legitimate, then we need to reconsider the vote. Celeste's nails pressed into the table. She knew she had lost. Jackson leaned back, satisfied. Good. Then let's get started. Anna, still standing outside, exhaled slowly, her heart racing. She had walked into this world as an outsider, but now she was part of it. and something told her this was only the beginning. Celeste was a lot of things: calculated, ruthless, dangerously ambitious, but she was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. Jackson knew this. He had spent years watching her navigate the Devereaux empire like a master chess player, always 3 moves ahead, always ready with a contingency plan. That's why, even as the board members flipped through the documents exposing her corruption, even as their expressions shifted from wary to outright concerned, Jackson didn't let his guard down. Because Celeste wasn't done. Not yet. She exhaled through her nose, slowly, her face impassive as she leaned back in her chair. The silence stretched, thick with tension, before she finally spoke. "Impressive," she said, almost amused. "You've clearly been busy." Jackson didn't react. He didn't need to. He had done what he came here to do, put her on the defensive. Now it was just a matter of seeing how she played it. Celeste tapped a perfectly manicured nail against the table. "But let's be honest, Jackson. You and I both know this isn't about corporate ethics. It's about power. You didn't come back because you suddenly care about Devereaux Industries. You came back because you don't like losing, because you can't stand the idea of someone else running the empire that was supposed to be yours." Jackson smirked. "And yet, here we are. You, in a room full of people questioning whether you belong at the table at all." Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened. "You're right. I miscalculated." She exhaled, tilting her head slightly, as if assessing him in a new light. "I thought you were still that reckless boy who ran when things got hard. Turns out you actually learned something." Jackson didn't let himself react. That's what she wanted, to get inside his head, to regain control of the narrative. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Celeste turned to the board, smoothing her blazer like this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "If the documents Jackson has presented are accurate, then of course I would expect a full review. I have nothing to hide." That was a lie. A carefully crafted, elegantly spoken lie. But Celeste was smart. She knew the real game wasn't played in these meetings, it was played in the moves made after. One of the older board members, a man named Holloway, cleared his throat. "A review will be conducted effective immediately. Until then, I believe the motion to remove Jackson should be put on hold." Celeste didn't even flinch. She simply nodded, as if she had expected that response. Naturally. Then, finally, she looked back at Jackson, her expression unreadable. "Congratulations. You bought yourself some time." Jackson held her stare. "You should have quit while you were ahead." Celeste just smiled. "Oh, Jackson, you know me better than that." And for the first time, he felt it. A whisper of something dark, curling at the edges of this so-called victory. Because Celeste wasn't finished. She was just getting started. Jackson didn't let himself relax, not even for a second. Celeste was too calm, too composed, and that meant she had something up her sleeve. As the board adjourned, murmurs filled the room, conversations already shifting away from the meeting and toward the scandal that had just unfolded. Antoine said nothing, only watching as Jackson stood, adjusting his jacket like he hadn't just walked into a battlefield and held his ground. Celeste, however, remained seated, watching him with the patience of a predator who knew the hunt wasn't over. Anna, who had been waiting just outside, caught Jackson's eye the moment he stepped into the hallway. She didn't ask questions, she didn't have to. The tension in his shoulders, the sharp edge in his expression, told her everything she needed to know. "It's not over, is it?" she murmured as she fell into step beside him. Jackson exhaled through his nose, the ghost of a smirk flickering at the corner of his lips. "Not even close." They barely made it through the lobby before Robert appeared, phone in hand, expression grim. He walked with purpose, his stride uncharacteristically fast. "We have a problem," he said, wasting no time. Celeste just moved faster than we thought. Jackson's jaw clenched. What did she do? Robert handed him the phone. She leaked a story to the press, an exposé on you. Anna felt the air shift, the weight of whatever was on that screen sinking into Jackson's frame like a vice tightening around him. He swiped his thumb across the screen, scanning the article. Jackson Devereaux, the irresponsible heir. Insider sources claim years of neglect, reckless behavior, and financial mismanagement. Jackson let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head as he skimmed the text. It was brutal, a carefully curated hit piece, highlighting every mistake he had ever made, twisting half-truths into damning accusations. Missed meetings, impulsive business decisions, moments where he had walked away instead of fought. Celeste had laid it all out, framing him as a man who was never fit to lead in the first place. And worse, the article wasn't just speculation, it had quotes from people inside the company. Anna caught a glimpse of the screen and felt her stomach drop. She didn't just set you up for failure in that meeting. She's making sure the public turns against you before you even get a chance to fight back. Robert nodded. By tomorrow morning, every investor, every shareholder, every employee will have read this. He met Jackson's gaze. She's cutting off your support before you can build any. You think the board is going to stand behind you after this? Jackson didn't respond immediately. His grip on the phone tightened, but his face remained unreadable. Then finally he exhaled, slipping the device into his pocket. Then we hit back harder. Anna narrowed her eyes. How? Jackson's smirk was sharp, dangerous. She wants to paint me as reckless? Let's show them exactly what reckless looks like when it's aimed in the right direction. Anna wasn't sure what that meant, but one thing was clear: Celeste had made a mistake. She thought she was controlling the game. But Jackson had just decided to flip the entire board. Jackson had spent years avoiding the weight of his last name, sidestepping responsibility, letting people believe he didn't care. And for a while, maybe that had been true. But Celeste's move changed everything. This wasn't just about control of a company anymore. It was about erasing him completely. She wasn't just trying to turn the board against him, she was dismantling his reputation, piece by piece, ensuring that even if he walked away, he would have nothing left to stand on. Which meant it was time to stop playing defense. Robert had already arranged a meeting with Lewis, the lawyer who had been working in the background to contain the fallout. But Jackson knew containment wouldn't be enough. If he wanted to win, he had to turn the story around. They gathered in a private suite at one of the city's most exclusive hotels, a neutral ground away from the Devereaux estate, away from boardrooms filled with people waiting for him to fail. The room was quiet, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the tension inside was anything but calm. Lewis wasted no time. The article is gaining traction. By tomorrow, it'll be everywhere. Investors are already nervous. We're hearing murmurs of potential withdrawals, key partners reconsidering their contracts. Celeste knew exactly what she was doing. He glanced at Jackson. If you don't get ahead of this, I know. Jackson's voice was steady, controlled. Anna, sitting across from him, studied his face. She had seen Jackson angry, frustrated, guarded. But this was different. This was focused. Robert folded his arms. So what's the move? A press statement? A counter-interview? Jackson shook his head. Number. That's what she expects. She wants me scrambling, defending myself, looking like I'm just trying to clean up a mess. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. We don't play her game. We make her play ours. Louis arched a brow. And how exactly do we do that? Jackson's smirk was cold. We give them a bigger story. Anna frowned. A bigger story? Jackson nodded. Right now, Celeste controls the narrative. She's banking on the board and the public believing I'm the problem. But what happens if we turn the spotlight onto her? Robert caught on first. You want to expose her. Jackson's smirk deepened. We already have proof of her financial misconduct. That was enough to shake the board. Now, we find something they can't ignore. Louis leaned back, considering. You're talking about digging deeper, finding something that forces her into a corner? Jackson nodded. Exactly. Something that makes the board realize that sticking with her is a bigger risk than backing me. Anna exhaled slowly. And what if you don't find anything? Jackson's gaze darkened. I will. Because Celeste had spent years covering her tracks, making herself look untouchable. But no one in power was clean, and it was time for him to prove it. The next 24 hours were a blur of movement. Jackson wasn't just reacting, he was orchestrating. He, Robert, and Louis worked in silence, combing through years of financial records, contracts, and internal communications. Every document Celeste had ever touched was being analyzed for inconsistencies, for the one thing they needed to take her down. And when they found it, it was bigger than even Jackson had expected. Louis placed the file on the table, his expression unreadable. She's been embezzling funds, not just siphoning money into offshore accounts. She's been redirecting corporate assets into dummy shell companies under different names, names that trace back to her. Jackson stared at the pages, the weight of what he was looking at settling in. This wasn't just corruption, this was fraud at the highest level. Robert let out a low whistle. If this gets out, she's finished. Jackson's smirk was sharp. Then let's make sure it does. Anna, who had been silent as she watched everything unfold, finally spoke. You're really going through with this? It wasn't a question. Jackson met her gaze. She tried to erase me, Anna. She thought I'd sit back and let her destroy everything. His voice was steel. She was wrong. There was no hesitation now. No doubt. This was war, and Jackson was finally playing to win. The next move had to be public. A quiet confrontation wouldn't be enough. Celeste had built her power on image, on credibility. That was what needed to be shattered. So Jackson made sure the story broke first thing in the morning, before Celeste could control it, before she could spin it. By the time she realized what had happened, it was too late. The article was everywhere. Front-page news. Business networks dissected every detail, how the documents had surfaced, how the evidence led directly to her, how an internal review had now been launched by the company. The headlines were brutal. Celeste Devereaux, under investigation for corporate fraud. Implications could be severe. Jackson sat back, watching the news unfold, the notifications flooding his phone. Every call, every text, every panicked message from the very people who had doubted him just a day ago. And then, finally, a call from Celeste herself. He let it ring twice before answering. Morning, Celeste. Her voice was ice. You think this is over? Jackson smirked. I think you finally know what it feels like to lose. Silence. Then, quietly, low and deadly. You have no idea what you've just started. Jackson's smirk didn't waver. Neither do you. And then he hung up. Because this wasn't just about a vote anymore. This was about who walked away with everything, and who walked away with nothing. Celeste wasn't the kind of woman who went down without a fight. Jackson knew that. He had been expecting retaliation the moment he hung up on her, but what he hadn't expected was how fast she would move. Less than an hour after the story broke, she struck back, and she struck hard. It started with a second wave of articles, this time not about Celeste, but about Jackson. Anonymous sources had come forward with claims that he had manipulated financials, that he had leaked confidential company information in a desperate bid to undermine his stepmother. The headlines painted a different narrative. Jackson Devereaux, a calculated attack or a last-ditch power grab. Then came the calls. Investors demanding answers, board members suddenly uncertain, the tide shifting again. It was a counterplay, and a damn good one. Celeste hadn't even tried to defend herself. She had turned the tables entirely, making Jackson look like the real threat. Robert stormed into the suite, tossing his phone onto the table. "She's good. I'll give her that." Jackson skimmed the articles, his jaw tightening. "She's desperate." Lewis was already on his laptop, scrolling through reports. "It's not just the press. She's working behind the scenes. We just got word. She's pushing for an emergency meeting with the board. She wants to force a vote before the investigation can even begin." Anna, standing by the window, folded her arms. "She's trying to cut you out before you can finish what you started." Jackson exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders, thinking. Celeste was betting that chaos would work in her favor. If she could convince the board that Jackson's return was more dangerous than her staying in power, then the damage to her reputation wouldn't matter. They would choose stability over scandal, even if that meant keeping a fraud in charge. He turned to Robert. "Where's my father?" Robert hesitated. "Still at the estate. Celeste has been keeping him out of the public eye, but from what I hear, he's not in any condition to—" "Doesn't matter," Jackson cut in. "We need to get to him before she does." Louis looked up from his laptop. "You think he'll back you?" Jackson's expression hardened. "I think he's still the only person whose word carries more weight than hers." Anna stepped forward. "Then what are we waiting for?" Jackson's gaze met hers, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of something steady beneath all the chaos. He nodded once. "Let's end this." They moved quickly, knowing that every second counted. The car ride back to the estate was silent, the air thick with unspoken tension. Jackson stared out the window, his mind already ahead, anticipating Celeste's next move. She wasn't going to let them get to Antoine easily. She knew exactly how much he still mattered, and that meant she was already preparing to shut them out. They weren't just walking into a meeting, they were walking into the final battle. The moment they arrived at the estate, Jackson knew Celeste was already ahead of them. The front gates were closed, the security detail tighter than before. She was locking him out. But that wasn't going to stop him. He pushed the car door open before Robert had even fully stopped, striding toward the entrance with Anna and Louis close behind. A guard stepped forward, blocking the path. "Mr. Devereux, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Mr. Antoine is not taking visitors." Jackson didn't slow. "He'll see me." The guard shifted but didn't move. "I'm under strict orders." Jackson's patience snapped. "Let me guess. From Celeste?" His voice was sharp, cutting. "You work for my father, not her. And I guarantee you, if you keep me from seeing him, you'll be the one looking for a new job when this is over." The guard hesitated. Just long enough. Then finally he stepped aside. Jackson didn't wait for permission. He pushed the doors open, striding through the grand foyer like he owned the place, which technically he still did. Celeste might have spent years consolidating her power, but she hadn't won yet. The house was quiet, eerily so. That was another tactic. Control the atmosphere, control the conversation. But Jackson wasn't playing into it. He knew exactly where to go. Antoine's study. He moved quickly, Anna following just a step behind. When he reached the door, he didn't knock. He pushed it open, stepping inside to find Celeste already there. She was seated in one of the high-backed leather chairs, her legs crossed, a glass of whiskey in her hand, as if she had been waiting for him. Antoine sat behind his desk, his face pale, thinner than the last time Jackson had seen him. His father's health was deteriorating fast, but his gaze was still sharp. He wasn't out of the game. Not yet. Celeste smiled, slow and knowing. "You're late?" Jackson's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. You must be getting nervous if you felt the need to cut me off before I even got through the door. Celeste took a measured sip of her drink. Nervous? Number, I just don't appreciate unnecessary theatrics, but I suppose that's always been your style. She gestured to Antoine. We were just discussing the future of the company. I'm sure you'll be thrilled to know that the board has agreed to an emergency vote tomorrow morning. Jackson exhaled slowly, his pulse steady. There it was, the final move. She wanted to rush the decision before the damage to her reputation fully unraveled, before the board had time to question her leadership. He met his father's gaze. And what do you think about that? Antoine studied him, his fingers laced together. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, his voice, though weaker than before, cut through the room like a blade. I think it's time to decide who actually deserves to run this company. Celeste's expression didn't falter, but Jackson saw it, the flicker of unease, the first sign of cracks forming in her control. Jackson took a step forward. Then let's settle this. Because one way or another, this was the last battle, and Jackson wasn't leaving without a win. Jackson didn't sit. This wasn't a conversation. This was a fight for the future of everything that had been stolen from him. Celeste might have spent years weaving her web of power, but Jackson had spent his entire life learning how to survive inside it. He turned to his father, who still held that calculating expression, the one that meant he was waiting, watching to see who was strong enough to win. You know she's only calling this vote because she's afraid, Jackson said, his voice steady, unwavering. She knows the longer this drags out, the worse it gets for her. The press isn't backing down, the board is uneasy, and investors are already questioning whether they want to tie their future to someone under investigation for fraud. He tilted his head slightly, eyes locked on his father. If you let her push this through now, you're letting her gamble with everything you built. Celeste exhaled, setting her glass down with deliberate slowness. Spare us the dramatics, Jackson. You think anyone in that boardroom actually believes you care about this company? She turned to Antoine, her expression calm, persuasive. He disappeared for weeks, only coming back when he realized he was losing control. And now he's trying to paint me as the villain when all I've done is protect this company in his absence. Jackson scoffed. Protect it? You mean bleed it dry while lining your own pockets? His gaze hardened. We both know your loyalty isn't to Devereaux Industries, it's to yourself. Celeste's smile was tight. And yours is to what, exactly? A name? A legacy you spent most of your life running from? Let's not pretend you've suddenly become the selfless heir, ready to take responsibility. Jackson took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that it forced silence into the room. I never wanted this company because I never wanted to become you. But what I do want, what I refuse to let happen, is for you to destroy what my family built just so you can feed your ego. Celeste's eyes flickered, just for a second, but Jackson saw it. Doubt, uncertainty. The cracks were forming, spreading through her carefully maintained control. Antoine leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His gaze moved between them before finally landing on Celeste. You had one job, he said, voice slow but sharp, to hold this company together, not turn it into your own personal empire. He shook his head slightly, and I see now that was a mistake. Celeste stiffened. For the first time, she looked genuinely caught off guard. Antoine turned to Jackson. If you want it, it's yours. A flicker of shock passed through Celeste's eyes, quickly masked, but Jackson saw it. She hadn't expected this. She thought she had time. But now, she was out of it. Jackson didn't move, didn't let himself exhale. He had won, but the final blow still had to be dealt. Celeste leaned back, her expression unreadable. Careful, Jackson. You might have the upper hand now, but you're playing in a world that doesn't forgive mistakes. If you think I'm dangerous, just wait until you see what happens when the wrong people start circling." Jackson met her gaze. "Then I guess I'll just have to make sure they know exactly who they're dealing with." Because this was his company now, and no one, not even Celeste, was going to take it from him again. Celeste's composure was cracking, but Jackson knew better than to assume she was finished. She never lost cleanly. She had spent years securing her position, ensuring that no one, not even Antoine, could remove her easily. The vote would still happen. But now, Jackson had what she didn't: his father's public backing. That alone shifted the power balance in a way she hadn't accounted for. Antoine's voice, though weaker than it had once been, carried authority. "The board will convene in the morning, but my decision is final. I founded this company, and I will not leave it in the hands of someone who only values it for what she can take from it." He let the words settle, then turned to Jackson, his expression unreadable. "This is your burden now." Jackson nodded. He understood the weight of what was being handed to him. For years he had fought to escape this life, to carve out something of his own away from the shadow of Devereaux Industries. But this wasn't just about his name anymore. Celeste had forced his hand, and now that he was in the fight, there was no walking away. He wasn't taking this company just to keep it out of her grasp. He was taking it because it was the only way to make sure it survived. Celeste exhaled slowly, as if accepting the loss. But Jackson knew better. She wasn't the type to admit defeat. Not really. "Impressive," she murmured, swirling the whiskey in her glass. "I underestimated you." Jackson smirked. "You did." Her lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in her expression. "Then let's see if you can actually hold on to it." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Celeste might have lost today, but she would regroup. She would find new angles to exploit, new weaknesses to manipulate. This wasn't over, not really. But Jackson didn't need it to be. He just needed her out. The vote the next morning was swift. The board, seeing the writing on the wall, sided with Antoine's wishes. Celeste's power was severed, her position revoked, her influence dismantled in a matter of minutes. By the afternoon, she was gone. Not in the dramatic crashing down in flames kind of way. No, Celeste was too smart for that. She left quietly, her things packed, her office emptied, no parting words spoken. But Jackson knew she wasn't disappearing. She was retreating, watching, waiting for an opening. But it didn't matter. She was no longer his problem. That night, Jackson stood in his new office, looking out over the New York skyline, the weight of it all finally settling onto his shoulders. He had won. He had everything. And yet, as he stared at his reflection in the glass, he felt something shift inside him. Anna walked in without knocking, setting down a glass of bourbon next to him. "I figured you could use this." Jackson glanced at her, his smirk softer than usual. "You always seem to know what I need." Anna shrugged, leaning against the desk. "It's a gift?" He picked up the glass, swirling the liquid before taking a slow sip. "So," he said, watching her, "you think I made the right call?" Anna tilted her head. "I think it was the only call." She held his gaze. "And I think you already know that this isn't the end. Winning is the easy part. Keeping it? That's the real challenge." Jackson nodded slowly. She was right. This wasn't happily ever after. This was just the start of a different kind of fight. But this time, he wasn't alone. He set the glass down and turned to her fully. "Stay," he said simply. Anna arched a brow. "For how long?" Jackson didn't hesitate. "As long as you want." She studied him for a moment, then smirked. "You really think you can handle that?" Jackson chuckled, stepping closer, his voice lower now. "I guess we'll find out." And for the first time in a long time, Jackson Devereaux wasn't running from anything. He was exactly where he was meant to be, and this time he was staying.